Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Dinelda Suley. I'm the Regional Rehab Coordinator with Central East Stroke Network. On behalf of Central East Stroke Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, presented by Katrina Steele. Professor Katrina Steele is a clinician scientist working in the area of swallowing and swallowing disorders. She has a background as a medical speech-language pathologist and is director of the Swallowing Rehab Research Laboratory at the Toronto Rehab Institute, University Health Network. She is a professor in the Department of Speech-Language Pathology at the University of Toronto and is in demand as a teacher and workshop instructor around the world. Professor Steele holds research funding from the National Institutes of Health, as well as several active industry contracts. She is a member of the Board of Directors for the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Steele.
Thank you, Dinelda. So it's really a pleasure to be talking to you today about the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, or IDDSI. And for just some initial disclosures to mention that the IDDSI initiative is a volunteer initiative with a board of directors, and we rely on sponsorship and funding from a wide variety of industry partners to whom we're very grateful. And those industry partners are not directly involved in the work of the initiative, but provide support in the background, and will be very important partners as we move forward. So we're here today to talk about texture modification as an intervention for dysphagia, for swallowing impairment. And the slide on the screen shows you one of the earliest publications in our field talking about this approach for managing dysphagia. The field of dysphagia itself is very young. The Dysphagia Journal began in 1986, and you can see here in 1990 this article being published. It's not a research article, but it does describe the approach used in a VA medical center at the time where Dr. Grower worked, where they were using texture modification specifically to manage their concerns about the risk of aspiration in their patient population. And when you go back to read this article, much of it will feel very familiar to the way that we manage dysphagia and aspiration risk from a texture management perspective today. And one of the things that's interesting to note is that this is the first documented use that we can find of the terminology nectar thick, honey thick, and pudding thick or spoon thick liquids. So that's probably where those terms started. Now, the reason that the IDDSI initiative came together was around concerns that when we use terminology to describe the textures that we're recommending for our patients, that this is prone to misunderstanding or to differences of interpretation across individuals. And I'm sure many of you have had that experience where you look at a liquid that has a label on it, perhaps nectar thick, and you think, not really sure that that's nectar thick. And I can certainly remember scenarios in my workplace where that conversation has happened. In fact, if you look across texture terminology around the world, there is huge variety in the names that are used. The slide here is taken from one of our IDDSI publications from 2013, and the link to that publication is shown on the slide. It's an open access, freely downloadable publication. And you can see on this slide, which looks at the terminology used for food, the variety. So there's anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6 different categories perhaps used in a given country. Some of these countries use conventions like the letters of the alphabet to label levels. They don't necessarily go in the same direction. If you compare the direction of the letters of the alphabet for the United Kingdom, they're opposite to the levels used in Australia and Ireland. You can see that some countries use numbers, like Japan. You can see colors, all sorts of different conventions. And you might notice that Canada, on this particular slide, is a good example of a country where there wasn't a standard convention that everybody was following in 2012, 2013. And in fact, around that time, there was an initiative from the Dietitians of Canada, I believe, to look at developing a Canadian national dysphagia diet with respect to texture modification guidelines. And in the lead up to that possible initiative, there was a survey of the terminology used. This slide shows you the food terms, and you can see just how many labels were in use in facilities across Canada. Some of these are more transparent. You can imagine what the label means, and others are less obvious. Things like level 3 doesn't have an obvious meaning to it. But clearly a lot of potential for differences of opinion. The same is true on the liquid side around the world, and in Australia, a publication from 2007 documented that even though there were guidelines in place at the time, that if you asked clinicians what are these 4 types of liquids called in your facility, that 39 different names were reported. On the food side, for 4 similar pictures depicting different degrees of texture modification, 95 different labels. So Canada and Australia were really quite similar in this regard. And even when we happen to have agreement about a label, so for example, we might call that first degree of thickening nectar thick. This study from 2000 in Australia showed that if you take those liquids from different hospitals that have the same label and measure their characteristics, that there's an alarming degree of variation. And so that it's not a fair assumption that a patient who leaves one facility with a prescription for a nectar thick liquid who was managing on that liquid in facility A will receive the same kind of liquid, even though it might have the same name, when they enter facility B. And this, if we believe, as we typically do, that getting the texture of a liquid or a food right for the patient, this becomes a safety risk. And a point that I quite like to make is that there are other areas in medicine where we would be horrified if we had this same degree of confusion or lack of clarity around prescribing or labeling items. And medication is the obvious example. If we said, I think you need a moderate degree of blood thinner, but didn't go beyond that to specify the details of what that meant, we would have a real healthcare crisis on our hands. But for some reason, food and nutrition haven't received the same degree of respect, if you like, or they're not treated as medication. And yet for people with dysphagia, they really have that potential both to be beneficial and for adverse events. And unfortunately, it doesn't take much to look through the coroner's report literature to find examples where the wrong texture has been served to a patient and there have been adverse events. This is most easy to do when looking at deaths arising from choking. And here on the slide are several recent examples of coroner's reports where people have choked to death on items. The first one I'll just highlight is an example right here from Ontario, where an elderly lady who had dysphagia diagnosed on her medical record went to an emergency room from the long-term care facility where she resided. During the course of that interaction, she was hungry and she asked if she could have some food. And even though the documented diet recommendation for her specified pureed foods, she was served an egg salad sandwich and choked to death. So choking on solid food is unfortunately not a rare occurrence. And I want to drive home one message here. If you take one thing away, it is that we really need to revisit the inclusion of bread on the diets of people with dysphagia. Bread is really the most implicated cause of choking deaths, and it is also a staple in our diets. So it's something that we often make exceptions for, but the truth is that it often sent into the pharynx in a less processed form. It can easily become an item that plugs the airway and result in death. And so we really need to look at this moving forward, and also on the assessment side, to think about the techniques that we have to determine with confidence whether or not something like bread is a risk for our patient. So the vision of the IDDSI initiative was to tackle this challenge around clear terminology and communication to promote safety for people with dysphagia around the selection and specification of diet texture modification, with the goal that this would not just be a Canadian initiative, not just a US initiative, but indeed a worldwide initiative that would apply to patients of all ages in all care settings. And here you get a picture of our current board of directors. Actually, this is slightly out of date picture, but there's a representative from Europe, Dr. Jan van der Wegen, who's not shown on this slide. We are really a group of passionate people who come together around this common problem, this common challenge, with a vision to improve the situation. And one of the things that's been very special about this initiative is that we come from different professional backgrounds as well as from different countries. And so there are all sorts of different relevant areas of expertise that have been brought to the table, from speech-language pathology and occupational therapy and dietitians, right through to physician, nurse, fluid mechanics engineer, food scientist, and so forth. And so I have to say that for me, it's been one of the most rewarding professional volunteer opportunities I've had in my career. So as we developed this vision, we ended up developing the IDDSI framework. And you can see on the slide here the different steps that we went through. One of the first steps was to study and document guidelines that were in place around the world and look at the similarities and differences across countries. We also did a survey of current practice at that time that you may have participated in. We then went on to conduct a systematic review of evidence in the research literature to understand what kinds of levels might be needed. And of course, as in many systematic reviews, that project resulted in a general impression that texture modification does have a place and can be beneficial for patients with dysphagia, but that there are lots of gaps in our knowledge, and specifically, we have not yet pinned down exactly how thick a liquid might need to be for a particular patient in order to address safety risks, and so that these are questions moving forward. And ultimately, we developed the framework and took it back out to survey for consumer feedback, and hopefully you may have participated in that as well. So the framework itself was published last year in 2017, and the link is also there shown on the slide. You can see that we ended up with two pyramids, one for the drink side and one for the food side. There are 8 levels in total, with levels 0 and 7 being unmodified drinks or foods. And then we liked the visual impression here that we move from a broad, unrestricted range at either end into a middle zone of the tightest degree of diet texture restriction. One of the paradigm shifts that occurred as we were developing our ideas around this framework was the realization that there are foods and drinks in the middle of this framework that have different names, but share the same characteristics. So pureed foods have similar characteristics to pudding thick or extremely thick liquids, so pudding thick being the old label in North America. And similarly, what we call now moderately thick liquids, which you would be familiar with the term honey thick, have arguably the same flow characteristics as the most modified food level where it's become liquidized. And so we address this by linking the food and drink pyramids using the same colors and the same number on the framework, but reserving different names for the food and liquid side. That was informed by consultation with kitchens and food service professionals who told us that it's important to be able to identify an item either as a food or a drink. That's led to lots of fun debates about whether things like soup are actually a drink or a food from a nutritional rather than a texture perspective. So that's the framework, and I hope that you have already got some familiarity, and if not, that you'll go and read that document. So where do we find ourselves today? We are just slightly under 1 year away from target date of implementation in North America. Both the United States and Canada have announced target dates of January the 1st. And it's important to understand what that means. We don't expect implementation to happen overnight. We don't expect that by January 1st, all hospitals and long-term care facilities across Canada will magically have switched to the new nomenclature. What this does mean, however, is that on the industry side, the partners who are involved in manufacturing commercially available liquids and foods for people with dysphagia have committed to having labeling by January the 1st that identifies where that food product or liquid product falls on the IDDSI framework. So it'll be transparently disclosed on a product label. It may be a label that still also shows the old familiar terms, which is a stage that we expect may happen where both labels are obvious, but the IDDSI label will be there by January 1st. And this will support care facilities to start transitioning their own labeling and their computer order entry systems and so forth into the new framework. And when I say that this has been endorsed or announced, the National Professional Associations for Speech Pathology, Occupational Therapy, and Dietetics in Canada have all endorsed a move to the IDDSI framework. That's also true in the United States. And you can see that there are similar initiatives going on in the United Kingdom and Australia, to mention a few. So as I alluded to a minute ago, this process of implementation won't happen immediately, and we believe there are several stages. Right now, you may be still in the awareness phase, and participating in the webinar today is one of the things that you might do to build awareness. And then once people are through that stage, then there's a very big phase of preparation. And I'm going to talk through today some of the resources that are available to support you in your facilities moving through that preparation stage towards adoption. We believe that there are really 6 key steps that individuals or organizations will need to go through, starting with building familiarity with the resources and the IDDSI website. I'll show you some of those in a few minutes. We recommend that you then form an IDDSI implementation team, and there may be layers to this team. You may have a corporate sort of oversight implementation team, as well as more local teams in different areas in your facility. So for example, there might be a team in the kitchen, or there might be a team on a particular unit. We really encourage you to make these teams interdisciplinary. This is a project that brings together, as I've mentioned, people from a variety of disciplines. Ideally, you would also engage a consumer, a patient, or a caregiver in your implementation team. Then there's the step of developing a calendar with targets for achieving different milestones in the process, and I'll show you a resource regarding that in a moment. There's a very important stage of educating stakeholders, and then a big stage of mapping the products in your facility to the framework so that it will be possible to transition. And finally, there are actually launching label changes and looking at other functions where diet terminology may need to be revised, such as in our assessment tools or report protocols and patient education materials. It's perhaps important to say that these 6 steps don't necessarily have to happen one after the other, that you could begin several of them at the same time and be partway engaged in perhaps all 6 at the same time. So I alluded a moment ago to resources that we've developed to support this implementation process. And this slide shows you a draft of a 12-month sort of Gantt chart for a facility to identify the subtasks under each of those 6 headings. This will be available on the IDDSI website momentarily, hopefully by the end of March. And there'll be 3 separate guides, one each for the 3 major groups that will need to be involved in leading implementation. So one for food service and catering, one for industry, and one for clinicians and healthcare professionals. And this particular slide shows you the master chart where all 3 of those groups can be seen on the same page. So look for that on the website very shortly. Now, in terms of the other resources that you can find on the IDDSI website, I really encourage you to go there and search through all of them. Obviously, one of the things that you will find is the detailed definitions of the characteristics of food and liquid on each level. And this is important when it comes to the mapping process that will inevitably need to happen. In addition, we have testing methods, which I'll talk about just in a moment, a statement of evidence, and very importantly for all of you, a frequently asked questions area and resource. That is a growing document, and so if you have a question, this is a great place to start to see if it's already been addressed, and if not, then you can send a question into the IDDSI office for feedback. Now, when it comes to measuring fluids, I'm going to show you here a video of the IDDSI flow test. This is the very user-friendly method that we have adopted for determining the thickness of a liquid. And this involves a slip-tip syringe, and you'll see on this video, hopefully, 4 syringes with 4 liquids of different thickness. And you'll see that the person doing the test is allowing the liquid to flow through those syringes. That happens for 10 seconds. And when the clock stops, the video isn't quite time aligned on my monitor, but you can see here 4 different levels of fluid remaining behind in the syringe. And that is the thing you're looking for. How much is left behind after 10 seconds of flow? And this delineates the 4 levels of thickened liquid. Level 1 will have between 1 and 4 milliliters left behind, level 2 between 4 and 8, level 3 between 8 and 10, and level 4, which is the extremely thick liquid level, really is above the limits of this particular test. And so you might have seen 1 or 2 little drops come out of the syringe, but effectively there's still 10 milliliters left behind, and that means that we need to move on to other tests to confirm the characteristics of that product. Now, doing the flow test sounds simple, and it really is relatively simple, but you need to have the right tools. And unfortunately, we've learned the hard way that you can't just go and pick up any syringe. It has to be a syringe that has the right dimensions. And in particular, the length of the syringe is important. From the 0 to the 10 milliliter line needs to be 61.5 millimeters long. And then the tip has to be the right kind of tip. So a slip tip syringe is what we've specified. It shouldn't be a catheter tip. And so on the slide, I've listed 4 models of the Becton-Dickinson syringe, which is the most commonly available syringe in Canada, that meet these specifications. We are also distributing at the moment business card size test cards that are a helpful pocket guide for this test, and we'll be making available very shortly the ordering information if you wish to order a stock of these cards yourself. We're hearing from people that they're very helpful to hand out to caregivers to empower them to do this test when they're preparing food for a person with dysphagia. So this business card actually has a 61.5 millimeter ruler along the edge, so you can take your syringe, line it up, and make sure that it's the right length. And then you can also line the syringe up with the residual fluid and see which color range the liquid would fall into, and you would then easily know which level on the framework that liquid falls into. Another quick tip that you might want to run just to satisfy yourself that you have a syringe that is performing as expected is to run water through the syringe. Water will exit the syringe completely in 10 seconds. And in fact, if you were to time the water exit, it would exit the syringe at 7 seconds. There would be nothing left. So that's a quick calibration. If you find that water is exiting faster than that, say 3 or 4 seconds, there's some sort of issue with the dimensions of the syringe, either the nozzle or the barrel itself. If you find that water is taking longer than 10 seconds to exit the syringe, then there's a different kind of problem. It could be in the syringe dimensions, or more likely, and I've experienced this myself, the syringe is dirty and something is blocking the exit of water from the nozzle. And so that would be a sign either to replace the syringe or to make sure that it's undergone proper cleaning. Now, as we move from the liquid triangle over to the food pyramid in the framework, we transition across levels 3 and 4 towards levels 5, 6, and 7. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that the syringe really has reached its limits in terms of being able to differentiate levels of flow at that point. And so this is where supplementary tests come in, and we've recommended 2 supplementary tests to discriminate clearly level 3 from level 4. The first is a fork drip test, and you can see that shown on the slide here. A level 3 moderately thick liquid will actively flow through the prongs of a fork, by contrast, a level 4 extremely thick liquid may over time form a tail that hangs underneath, but it's not actively flowing. And then there's the spoon tilt test, and this becomes useful also as you go up above level 4. What we're looking at here is the stickiness of the product. And so at level 3, we want it to flow actively off the spoon, and you can see that happening at the top here, without leaving a strong residual coating. And at level 4, we also want it to leave the spoon without leaving a lot of coating behind, but it will fall off or plop off in one more sort of cohesive bolus. So that's a distinction between those. And in terms of how much can be left behind on the spoon, If the coating is sort of translucent and you can see through it and appreciate the spoon, so it's just a thin coating, then that is acceptable. But if it leaves a big, heavy, sticky coating, then that really suggests that the product is unlikely to be suitable for a person with dysphagia. Moving further up the food pyramid, we enter the more solid levels. And here, in addition to stickiness or cohesiveness, we're interested in two other properties. One is particle size, and this is a really, really important property when it comes to choking risk. So at level 5, minced and moist, we've specified a particle size of 4 millimeters for adults and 2 millimeters for pediatrics. What we mean by this is that if you take a fork and press lightly onto the bolus, that the pieces of the bolus will easily fit through the prongs of a fork and not be bigger than that. And so you can see that illustrated here on this slide. And it just happens that the standard gap between the prongs of a fork, a dinner fork, is 4 millimeters. So that's sort of a fortunate finding on our part. And yes, we actually went out and measured gaps between prongs of forks around the world. So, and again, if you're not certain if the fork you have is suitable, you can easily get a little ruler and check that finding. Particularly if you're using plastic forks, I would recommend that you check that. When it comes to the next level, soft and bite-sized, this particle size piece is really, really important. At this level, we've specified a maximum particle size of 1.5 centimeters in the biggest dimension of the piece of food. How can you measure that? Well, the width of the dinner fork will be about 1.5 centimeters. A thumbnail is also a good sort of reference. And why did we choose this dimension? Well, we chose this dimension based on studies that talk about the diameter of the airway. And what we want here is to have a maximum particle size that will actually slide through the larynx and airway without getting stuck and causing an obstruction. It sounds a little bit odd to talk about being comfortable with that happening, but opposed to food getting lodged and stuck, continuing to move is in fact a much safer situation. We are very aware that this size specification at level 6 is causing a lot of conversation. The reality is that we have not been managing this bite-sized specification on our historical mechanical soft level diets, and that this is a choking risk. And so when it comes to the pieces of food in casseroles, again, when it comes to bread and sandwiches, this is a piece that we are not surprised to find coming up as a frequent challenge area. And it really boils down to a question of being certain whether your patient is at risk. There is a sort of cognitive consideration here that you may feel that you have a patient who is able to manage the cutting of food into these bite-sized pieces themselves. And in a particular facility, that might be something you can decide is the case. Or you may be working with a more cognitively vulnerable population where one can't assume that they're going to make this bite-sized specification change themselves when the food is served, and that's a risk piece that you want to manage by making sure that the food doesn't reach the patient before it is modified into those bite-sized pieces. So that, I'm sure there might be some questions about that. The third property of food that needs to be dealt with is the hardness. And so here, as you go through the definitions, you'll discover that we have a test where we apply fork pressure to the bolus, just enough so that the thumbnail will blanch white. So that's the degree of pressure that you're applying. And then the food is described based on how it deforms when that pressure is applied. And this gets at how hard it is to process that food and chew it orally. So as you're beginning the challenge of mapping foods and measuring foods in your kitchen, in your facility, a number of resources are available. There is an IDDSI app, which is available for free, both on the iOS and Android platforms. And so I encourage you to download the app. This is something you can show to family members of patients with dysphagia. They can download the app. The definitions are there, and there are demonstration videos of each of the testing methods there as a resource. And over time, other things will be delivered through the app. But for those of you working in healthcare facilities, I think even more useful resource for that mapping stage are the audit sheets that we've made available. There are audit sheets for every level in the framework, and these will support you to do that mapping. And you can see an example here of level 6 soft and bite-sized auditing. We tell you the critical tests that must be applied. So a food would need to satisfy all of the requirements on this level. We've given you a tracking sheet, and we've specified consideration of time. So is this product suitable at the time of service, and how does it change over time if it's left standing? So that's a consideration that, again, something that's really been relatively unmanaged in our healthcare facilities. And we all know that the properties of thickness and hardness and slipperiness, for example, may well change as a function of changes in temperature or time. Another thing that has been developed are standard abbreviations for each of the levels. This primarily was motivated to facilitate the change of computer order entry systems for diet management. And so these definitions have been carefully chosen to make sure that they don't suggest other common medical abbreviations. And these are being rolled out in upgrades to common diet management software. One of the things I want to illustrate on this slide is, and to drive home, is that a diet, none of the levels by themselves on the framework are a diet. A diet needs to have typically 3 components specified. One is the nutritional content, and that typically is specified first in nutrition care process terminology. Then there's a specification of the food, and then there's a specification of the liquid. And what we've come to appreciate over time is that these specifications of food and liquid actually represent boundaries of a range, so that if your patient is suitable to have minced and moist foods, it's probably most of the time also reasonable to assume that they would be fine to receive pureed foods, so more modified foods. Similarly, if they are okay to receive mildly thick liquids, then it's probably most of the time fair to assume that they would also be okay on moderately thick liquids or extremely thick liquids. And you can see that there are some possible logical errors that may have existed before. I can remember a situation where we specified putting thick liquids for patients, but the pureed fruit that they were getting was thinner than that, and this was causing some confusion. So we've sort of evolved in our thinking away from the idea that a diet is all at one level on the framework, more to a diet that is composed of levels that fall between boundaries across a range. And so this particular specification would allow a patient to have items from 4 different levels on the framework. When you come to mapping, I think this becomes helpful. This is a slide that's probably not in the handout, but to illustrate for you how you might go about mapping a standard dinner tray. So on this particular day, we're looking at whether this particular tray is suitable for a person who has a specification of soft and bite-sized food and slightly thick liquids. And we can see that one item on the tray meets the testing requirements for level 6, that would be the carrots. We have 2 items that actually meet the testing requirements for level 5, minced and moist. We have 4 items that meet the specifications for level 4, pureed or extremely thick liquids. We have 2 items that meet the specifications for level 3 and 1 that falls into level 1. And so for this patient with that range, this tray would be suitable. But if the range were tighter than that, let's say that the maximum food texture that they could tolerate was level 5, then the carrots would be a concern for this particular patient. So as I've suggested, please do go to the IDDSI website and troll through all of the available resources there. And you can also sign up to receive e-bites from IDDSI as we have information to share. The frequently asked questions resource is there, and please study that and let us know if there are things that are not addressed here or that are unclear. All of our publications are available for free via links on the website and also for the handout for today's webinar. And we're committed to making the IDDSI information available public domain, and so wherever possible, we will continue to make our publications available open access. Another thing just to mention is that we're in the process of translation. This is a very large volunteer initiative. You can see on the right-hand side of this particular slide that I've got some French labels visible. These are in fact the French-Canadian translation, which was finalized late last summer. And you can see that we have slightly different translations for France, French, and Canada French, for example. And when a language comes up, our plan is to solicit help in translating the framework and descriptors document and the testing methods document. If you are fluent in another language and interested in helping, then please let us know. The process involves an initial translation, a draft that is then made available for review by speakers of that language. And then once the review phase has finished, we finalize the document. So that really brings me to the end, and I hope we have some time for questions. To emphasize again that this initiative is about promoting safety in diet texture modification for people with dysphagia. And I'm happy to take questions.
All right. So just a reminder to everyone to please enter your questions into the questions module, and I will read them off. We do have a few here. Mm-hmm. The first one is, what is meant by stakeholders? And I believe the context for this is on slide 15. One of your 6 key steps was to spread the word, educate key stakeholders. So
sure.
Could you just expand on that a bit?
So stakeholders could be a variety of different people. It'll depend on your context. If you're in a big corporation, there will be leadership, people who might be stakeholders who will be important for supporting the process towards implementation. Clearly, clinicians who are involved in dysphagia assessment are stakeholders, but also clinicians who care for the patients. So, for example, nursing, I think, are important stakeholders. Physicians are stakeholders in terms of supporting diet recommendations and prescriptions. The patients themselves and their families are stakeholders, and so a whole variety of different people. And I believe in the implementation guide we've given some further detail about who you might want to consider educating.
All right. Our next question is from Ella. In terms of IDDSI implementation, how would this impact a more rural setting where the staff is smaller? I'm a dietitian for a small hospital in Southern Ontario, and I think this would be a wonderful thing to try and integrate into practice. Was just wondering if there were any tips for a more rural setting versus an urban setting.
That's a great question. Thank you, Ella. I think this project can be implemented in all sorts of different settings, and perhaps it's important to say you don't have to ask our permission to start. You also don't have to ask our permission to use our resources. We just ask that you acknowledge our Creative Commons license and copyright acknowledgement. Definitely, wherever an implementation project starts, champions are needed. And so, Ella, you might be the person to start the ball rolling. We don't currently have a registry of implementation projects. That's sort of something with hindsight we wish we had done. But what we are doing is trying to share learning from people who are further ahead on implementation. And so another resource on the IDDSI website is our own webinars that have just started. And I know that there's one coming up about implementation in long-term care that was led by Chelsea Robb, who's a dietitian in New Brunswick. And so I'd encourage you to go either sign up for those webinars or watch them once they've been recorded to take suggestions that other people have found helpful.
Karen is asking about the IDDSI app and the password to register, asking what that is.
I don't know the answer. If you're having trouble, just send an email to the IDDSI office at communications@idsi.org, and hopefully they'll be able to troubleshoot with you.
So, Katrina?
Yes.
I actually do have
Oh, you do know the answer?
Some more information to add to that, because we tried it out when the question came in.
Okay.
There's a separate button that you click. You just say register, and you set up your own username and password.
Perfect. Great.
Right. The next question is from Allison. To what extent has this been developed with pediatrics in mind?
Oh, thank you, Allison. Very much. Our vision was to have a framework that would work for pediatrics as well as adults. And I think, in fact, what's been most exciting to watch is the fact that historic national diets really have not addressed the needs of pediatric patients with dysphagia terribly well. But this seems to be really filling a gap. And we are hearing lots of examples of facilities that are really empowering parents to, for example, do flow tests at home before they decide whether to serve something to their child. And the most recent webinar on the IDDSI series was from a children's hospital in California. The slightly thick level is particularly chosen with pediatrics in mind. We've known for years that pediatric clinicians feel that nectar thick or mildly thick is too thick for many babies with dysphagia, but that thin is too thin. And so slightly thick falls somewhere in the middle. So we really hope it will address needs with that population as well.
It is 1 o'clock.
Yes.
Katrina, are you able to stay on to answer a few more questions?
I am, and for those that we don't manage, I'm happy to try to put answers in writing so they can be shared as well.
Okay. All right. So I'll continue asking them if people want to remain online for a few more minutes. And then any others, we can send out the responses by email. So the next question is, are considerations such as the next one is, when will the Ministry of Health require implementation of this program?
That's a great question, and unfortunately one I'm not able to answer. So the rollout is happening from a grassroots frontline up. and with support from regulatory or professional association levels. Across Canada, there are some locations where ministries are actually coming on board and announcing dates. So in British Columbia, for example, that's the case. But at the moment in Ontario, I'm not aware of that. I do know that the Canadian Society for Nutrition Management is currently approaching ministry representatives to have a discussion about that. And then the other thing that I think is helpful is that the coroner's report for that case I mentioned from 2016, which came from in the geriatric and long-term care report of the coroner's office, actually specified IDDSI implementation as something that they felt was important to move towards as a way of reducing choking risk.
Okay. Our next question is, are considerations such as no two-textured food or no bread considered within the framework, or would they be extra modifiers in our diet prescription?
That's a great question as well. So when you go through the framework and the descriptors, you'll discover that bread and two-phase textures or mixed consistencies are only on level 7. This is because either they are known to be particularly risky, as I've mentioned with bread, or they're particularly challenging. And so when we talk about a mixed consistency, we're talking about a product where the fluid actively flows away from the more solid components. And so level 7 regular foods is a very big level. And sometimes it feels like the jump down to level 6 is quite a big restriction. But yes, we think that those kinds of foods are not suitable. Now, one comment qualifier here might be around gravy. I've had questions around gravy on top of mashed potatoes. Does that count as a mixed consistency? And so I think that really one needs to look at the consistency of the gravy and the consistency of the mashed potatoes. If the gravy itself is already moderately thick, if you ran it through a syringe, and the mashed potatoes are level 4, then really the combination of consistencies there is level 3 and level 4. And as long as we're not seeing a sort of level 1 or 2 or 0 fluid actively flowing away from the mashed potato, the oral processing challenges that exist with mixed consistencies aren't really there with that combination. And so I think you could make sure that the thinnest item on the tray, the gravy, is still within the liquid tolerance range for the patient.
All right. The next question is from Sue. In a hospital setting, who is doing the testing of the food products? And what about the long-term care setting? Who makes their own food? Who does the testing?
Yeah, I think this will vary from site to site. I know, for example, at our hospital that there is some flow testing happening in the kitchen, particularly with products that are made in-house, where thickeners are being added. And from a quality assurance perspective, those are being checked before they go on the tray. On the other hand, the testing is relatively straightforward. So it could be that you would decide that you wanted to know that the food or fluid was in a particular range at the point of serving. And so it might be that you decide to teach nurses or people who are delivering food to run some of these tests. I think it can vary. This sort of opportunity to empower people to check, to identify safety risks where they exist is, I think, one of the strongest parts of the initiative. I should perhaps also say that it's not surprising when people start to test that there could be a stage of some shock when you realize that something that you thought was honey thick is not testing honey thick, not testing moderately thick, that there's a recalibration that will happen. And to some degree, by empowering people to run these tests, we're revealing to people problems of long-standing, risks of long-standing that have not been on the radar before.
The next question is from Justine. I'm interested in the audit handout used for the diet preparation in facilities. Is there something similar in the works that we can provide for families at home who are preparing diet textures for patients, for example, so they can audit themselves?
I think you could use the audit tools that are there. It's a great suggestion. And I think we'd welcome your feedback on them if you feel that they would need to be modified for non-clinician, non-kitchen users like family members, then we'd welcome those suggestions. But for now, teaching family members the testing methods and equipping them with an audit sheet is perfectly appropriate.
All right, from Suzanne, will home care or LINs be educated on IDDSI, or is it up to the clinicians, in brackets, dietitians or SLPs, to educate case managers or case coordinators, for example?
Yeah, we would be looking to you as the end users to be our champions here, and they would be a stakeholder that would be very appropriate to begin educating. The IDDSI Board of Directors itself is just a volunteer group of people who do this outside our day jobs. And so we really look to the community of clinicians and food service professionals to help be the engine of carrying this out into implementation.
Okay, we have about 6 questions left, Katrina, and over 100 people still here. Would you like to continue?
Great. I'm happy to do that.
All right. So the next question is from Carla. How do you make vegetables small enough to fit the 15 millimeter by 15 millimeter? I have just left our vegetables the way they are for the soft of the diet. We don't have a special vegetable chopper. Do you?
I think I would have to defer to other people for this answer, but I do know that a consideration here is finding food processors or machines that will chop vegetables down to a suitable size without over processing them. If you send that question in to IDDSI communications@IDDSI.org, then we'll direct it to somebody on the board who might have more information.
All right. From Tanya, are there going to be already established tested values for the fluids, such as milk, tomato juice, etc.?
So, no, I don't think there are going to be established test results. There are a few. So, for example, on our website, we have an information sheet on tested results for Veribar, which is a line of barium used in the United States for swallowing assessment. But I think the part of the power of the approach here is to recognize that that variations happen. And so, for example, it's a myth to assume you can take the same amount of thickener and add it to different liquids and expect them to come out the same on the other side, because the thickener will interact with things like protein content or the acidity of the liquid and may thicken differently. And so this is where testing your liquid, whatever you have, whatever product you've been able to source, and understanding where it tests today at this temperature under these conditions. And if it tests thin today, then you would have that information and be able to decide whether you were going to thicken it or put it aside for the day. So it's really about empowering people to make those decisions on a day-to-day basis.
All right. And has the flow test been tested in a geriatric population?
Yes, it definitely has. So I know it's being used in New Brunswick at the long-term care facility that I mentioned where the webinar is being done. I'm not sure if that's quite the nature of the question, but yes, it has. If I haven't quite understood the question, maybe you can edit and add more information there.
Okay. How would oral medication administration fall under the IDDSI framework?
This is a very important question. So we've decided that we're going to focus on diet texture and not enter the slippery slope world of medication. That said, of course, if a person has a requirement for a thickened liquid and the medication that they need is only available in thin, then you would have an issue to troubleshoot. On the other hand, if they need pureed food and the medication is only available in a large pill, then there's a different kind of issue to troubleshoot. And there is emerging information on the pharmaceutical side about, in some cases, serving pills with a thickened liquid that involves certain thickening agents can interfere with medication uptake. So this goes beyond the scope of IDDSI itself, but it's certainly a topic we're aware of, and I would encourage you to talk to the pharmacists, and we know that this whole thing about delivering medication to individuals with swallowing impairment is a big challenge.
All right, just a couple more. Is it your opinion that all individuals, from pediatrics to oncology patients to geriatric medicine, fall easily into these levels? In our hospital setting, many patients currently fall between level 6 and 7.
So level 6 to level 7 is in fact the one zone where we are getting a lot of comments. And I think if you think about the clarification I made where the levels themselves are not the diets, it's the components that go into the diet that are pulled from different levels that needs to be specified. So it may be that there are individuals whose typical diet is level 6, soft and bite-sized, but that at some point in their care, you decide that they're ready to do some other levels, some other items from level 7 on a trial basis, for example. So they would be in a transition zone, and that would need to be specified in the diet prescription. And this is certainly an ongoing discussion, these people that sort of seem to fall on that boundary. The other obvious group here is people who are otherwise well but have dentures. Do they need level 6 soft and bite-sized, or would they be fine with softer items that are in level 7 but not needing the bite-size specification? And so I think this is just a zone in the framework that is still under discussion.
All right, and from Andrea, bread sandwiches are clearly addressed in the framework, but there is less detail about other baked items, muffins, cookies, pancakes, toast, biscuits, etc. Is it correct that they would not be allowed except on level 7 unless they're cut into 1.5 centimeter pieces? If so, are any organizations providing these items in cut form? Are they soaking them, forming them, or do their patients typically not get bread? Just trying to get an idea of how this is being addressed elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrea. It is correct that they would be treated similarly to bread in terms of where they fall in the framework. But this is also obviously a place where recipes and methods for developing modified baked goods is a gap that is going to need to be filled. I'm aware of a recipe that, or a process, if you will, that has been developed by a chef in collaboration with Peter Lamb to develop a minced and moist egg salad sandwich, where the bread component is effectively bread crumbs that are then moistened, and the filling is a level 5 minced and moist filling, and then there's another layer of breadcrumbs, and they're placed in a mold. They're moistened and they're left in the fridge for a certain amount of time, and then when you press them with a fork, they would behave like a minced and moist level. So there's a lot of opportunity for creative recipe development. And in fact, there's going to be a competition in June, which is Dysphagia Awareness Month, which is being run in collaboration with the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders, where we're really putting out a call for people to share successful recipe development for modifications of things that would usually be in level 7, but they've managed to create level 6 or level 5 versions. So watch for that. We're hoping that there'll be sort of Instagram or video type examples submitted.
All right. And Sylvia snuck in one last question. If we're to do flow testing on a regular basis, how much time will be required as staff and time is limited in long-term care? I'm afraid shortcuts will happen.
Yeah, I don't know the hard answer here. We do recommend that if you're going to run a test, that you might need to run it 3 times. So that's probably about a minute to run 3 samples through the syringe. I imagine that facilities will develop sort of standard quality processes for how often they want to check certain things.
All right, that's all of the questions.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for taking the time to answer everyone's questions. Thank you for presenting today. Thank you to the attendees for such wonderful questions and for participating in today's webinar. Just ask that you take a few minutes of your time to answer the survey that will appear upon completion of the webinar, and enjoy the remainder of your day. And we'll sign off now. Goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Goodbye.